Hi everyone and welcome to my updated guide for the GoD Demon Hunter in Season 28. This build just got a massive surprise buff in the final patch notes and it's one of the best speed farming builds in the game now, including for 4-man speed farming as well. So this was done as a result of the big rework that Natalia has received with the spike traps. And on the PTR we had this spin to win spike trap playstyle that was beloved by some people and hated by others. So they decided to give GoD a bit of a bump. And this was also a suggestion that I made, even though I felt GoD was already in a good spot. But now it's +4 GR tiers, pretty much exactly, and really like on the level of some of the other top builds, so that's really great. If you have played the build before, then there is not really all that much different, but I have the updated D3 planners here, including with the Season 28 theme, and some stuff to talk about there, so stay tuned for those. The principle of this build is very simple. You spin and you win, and that's it. So you have a very high mobility because the set gives you +160% movement speed on its own, and it fires out your hanging arrows automatically when you hit enemies with strafe. So you strafe around super fast and you shoot these arrows all the time. The only thing you have to do is you have to press your hanging arrow around every 4 seconds once to get this momentum buff that gives you extra damage and the speed, and this allows you to just zoom through those rifts. And other than that, you don't really have to press many buttons and just keep up your buzz. You can do more damage with the so-called hanging arrow weaving. So in between the strafe ticks, you press hanging arrow more frequently than once every 4 seconds. For example, as you can see right now on the boss, this is something I do on the high HP targets to get a few more arrows out. So you press it like once every second or so. This is not really a requirement. It's only for the tryhards. So if you want to speed up the runs ever so slightly. But for example, when you try to push for this build, you definitely have to press the button as much as possible in the right rhythm so that you get as many hanging arrows out as possible in addition to the automatic ones. While this is one of the best farming builds in the game, it's not really great for pushing. You have very low AoE damage because of the limited amount of pierces that is on a quiver. And this makes it so that you kind of just eventually hit a brick wall in pushing. And when you go like beyond 135, 140 or something like that on the higher end, it's going to start getting real tough. So this is a very strong build, especially T16, especially speed farming and stuff like that. Potentially 4-man meta, but you won't go very high with this. You simply don't have the AoE. So for this, you have to play Marauder or the new Natalia as a Demon Hunter. Now let's jump into the setups here. There is a lot of different variations, but they're all fairly similar. So what you need to know is we have the GoD set. I already explained a few of the mechanics. We have the momentum and the extra speed from the 2 and the 4-piece bonus. So every around 4 seconds, you need to shoot 1 hanging arrow manually to keep up this momentum buff. There is a bug that sometimes you don't get this buff, so you might have to do it slightly more often than that. And usually at the start of the run, so when you enter the rift for the first time, you also want to shoot like 5 times in a row before actually starting to go anywhere, so that you get this momentum buff stacked. And then you just like start spinning and you fly through the rift. These runs are usually very fast, so you're aiming for something like 2 minutes or faster in most cases. So that's kind of the pace that you want to farm at with this set. Then we have some other like pretty strong items, especially the quiver. The Knife Series Satchel, this is a hanging arrow quiver. So this is the item for this build basically. Gives you a 600% increased damage, gives you guaranteed pierces up to 4. So this item alone gives you like a 10 tier buff or 15 tier buff or something like that. It's crazy. And then there is a few like smaller things. So the Hunter's Wrath, another relatively strong item here, plus 200% damage. Also makes the clicking a bit smoother. And obviously stuff like Dawn, we have Perma Vengeance with this. Wraps of Clarity for the toughness. And usually have Focus and Restraint for 2 times 50% extra damage. And the Squirt's Necklace again for more extra damage. And finally, the Death Diggers. This is a generator build, so this is another really strong item here. And we also combine this, for example, with Simplicity Strength, which is a very powerful legendary gem. And usually you have Trapped and Taeguk. Since you're spinning all the time, you have Taeguk up all the time. In some scenarios, you will replace, for example, the Trapped here with Boon of the Hoarder in T16. So when you do T16 rifts, you can just get a bit more speed, get a gold, etc. Or for example, in groups, you also replace the Taeguk with a Zaze. So usually you're not really that far away from enemies, but in groups in particular, or for example, when you solo push with the Odyssey setup that I'm going to go into in a second, you also have the Zaze because Taeguk is an additive damage buff, and in groups in particular, you have a lot of these buffs, and the Taeguk has a very low value. So this is why you switch out the gem there. But in general, those items that I just mentioned are the same in all the different variations. And then there's a few little tweaks, like the gem or like the second weapon. So you see here, for example, in the speed setup, we have a Fortress Ballista. This one gives you a shield up to 30% of your life, which actually is up pretty much all the time. So as long as you don't take a lot of burst damage at once, you can quite easily protect your Squirt's Necklace with that and have this permanent 100% damage buff, which is very helpful. But maybe when you're starting out and you get hit too often and you have low toughness, this might drop more easily, but it will get better and better as you go. So something to keep in mind. In pushing, there's also people that like the Vala's Bequest. This is an item that gives the strafe projectiles a pierce. This does not actually directly improve the damage of the build. So while strafe is the trigger for those hanging arrow procs, you actually do not get more pierces with your hanging arrows. You just get pierces with strafe that allow you to get slightly more hanging arrow procs. So it's getting quite far into the details of how the set works, but there is a 9 frames cooldown on this 4-piece bonus that produces those automatic hanging arrows. So what happens with Vala's Bequest is that your strafe projectiles more often hit an enemy exactly when the cooldown is ready, instead of, for example, after 10 frames or 11 frames, etc. And you get a bit more hanging arrows, but you don't actually do more damage or more pierces with those hanging arrows. So what this means in practice is that for pushing scenarios with large pulls, this is something of a 20% DPS buff or so, and it goes lower and lower up to 0 when you fight a Rift Guardian with fewer targets, basically. What you can do on the higher end of pushing is, again, swap in the Fortress Ballista to protect your Squirt's Necklace, because otherwise you don't have any shield and you have to protect the Squirt's Necklace with only your smoke screen, which can be pretty difficult to do depending on the rift that you're running and what you're fighting against. And finally, here's the Odyssey's end version. So this is the best setup to push with if you want to try as high as possible. This is definitely like a tier or 2 better than the other versions. And you have to play with 2 different generators. So a little bit like the support Demon Hunter, you have to use Entangling Shot to apply this Odyssey's end buff. So you can switch between the 2 generators, entangle for a little while, and then switch back to Hanging Arrow to do damage. So especially on the conventional element cycle, you can do like massive bursts like this. And then you have to make sure that at least once every 3 or so seconds, you shoot 1 more entangling shot to keep up the debuff on all the monsters around you. This is pretty tough to do, so I do not recommend that if you're like starting out with this build and you're not really comfortable. But I do have a bunch of pushes done with this setup here on my channel, so you can go check them out. If you just search for GoD Demon Hunter and my name, you will find those. So this is what you usually have to do at the higher end. In Season 28 in particular, there's also this shrine version, so we're gonna get the empowered shrines from the potion buff. So a lot of builds have these kind of setups where you drop a lot of cooldown reduction. In this case, you can push without Dawn and actually have permanent vengeance. So you get both Odyssey and Fortress Ballista. But keep in mind that this is quite fishy. If you're just starting out the season, I also want to mention this Guardians setup here. So if you're like very low Paragon, it might be worth running with this set instead. So you can go with a Ring of Warrior Grandeur instead of the Convention, which makes it also easier and more smooth to play. You have the Guardian, Belt and Bracer, and then you equip the Death Diggers and cube the Hunter's Wrath. So this is a pretty good setup if you're like really low Paragon. There are also some people that instead of this Guardian set on the higher end run with Orgulls. So you have Orgull Bracer and Shoulder, for example, and you have the typical Hunter's Wrath equipped, Death Diggers in the cube, and you drop the COE for the Ring of Royal Grandeur. But at this point you also drop the Wraths of Clarity that give you a lot of toughness, and the Orgull set doesn't make up for it. So usually I'm not a fan of that because, well, you have the Fortress Ballista for a reason, and you're not exactly super tanky on this build. So losing the Squirt's Necklace buff is very easy in squishy setups of this. And usually it doesn't really matter if you have COE or not, it's just like an extra damage buff that comes around while speed farming. And I definitely prefer that setup. But in the end, they produce pretty similar results. And if you really don't like this ring, you can swap to the Guardian or the Orgulls. Lastly, I want to highlight the form and speed variants. There's not really that much to change here, but a few things to be aware about. I did talk about the Taeguk versus Zaze already, but there's also other things like the Wolf Companion. Usually you have a support Demon Hunter in the party, and they will provide the Wolf Companion permanently. The buff doesn't stack, so you can drop it, for example, for Caltrops. So Caltrops, 10% extra crit chance is really neat. You can just slot that in, and then whenever you have like an elite fight, you just drop a caltrop, maybe in an Oculus ring even, and you just spin around on top of that, and then you have a bit of extra DPS. And then depending on how fast you go with your group, you can also swap out some of the passives. So usually you just have like a lot of damage passives. Ambush is very, very good. We have Call the Weak, also with Trapped. So usually this is how you block it, but in groups you have the supports also slowing enemies. You have Steady Aim, very strong offensive choice as well. Archery, that helps a bit with the resources and extra crit. So there is stuff like that. But for example, if you go really fast with especially support Necros, a bit similar to Red Runs, you can also do Blood Vengeance and Tactical Advantage, and even Smoke Screen Displacement. Usually you should go Special Recipe here, which reduces the cost, but with this combo and Infinite Globe spawned by the Z-Necro, you will have no trouble just spamming Smoke Screen even if it costs more, and you can go real fast for those like 60 to 90 second runs. Lastly, when it comes to gearing, some things to know is that it usually does matter all that much if you are using the 9 Series Satchel or cubing it, as long as you have all the items here, so you can just wear the quiver, that's fine. It's usually slightly better, especially in parties, to dual wield, because you have more crit chance in parties from the party buffs, on for example the caltrops, so you get a bit more value from dual wielding with the extra crit damage here. But it depends on which items exactly you have and which items are good that you own. Other than that, there's not really that crazy stuff you need to roll. You just need to make sure that you have a bit of cooldown, so usually the diamond, the shoulder, maybe 1 or 2 other items. Especially the weapons is good on dual wielding setups. And this ensures that you have permanent vengeance, so make sure you reach 37% with a Dawn, or at least with a perfect Dawn. If your Dawn is much lower than 65, you might need more. And this is basically it when it comes to gearing. The rest is just like the typical crit, cold damage, and maybe some air damage wherever you can slot it in, or even the average damage range on the rings is also pretty nice. Now, I don't have any footage of Torment 16 runs and Bounty runs here right now, but the build works pretty much exactly the same. You're just like super OP, everything should die one shot. In fact, you are so strong that you can even change the rune. You can even go with the Lightning rune on Hungering Arrow, which produces more pierces and has a bit better coverage. So if your damage feels very good in T16, you can swap to that. Or you can even go with Bolas. So there is the Bolas quiver, the MMI's duffel. You can go with that instead of the Hungering Arrow quiver, and then also switch the skill. And like this, you can just like speed around and everything dies instantly with a bigger explosion. So at least later on, this will be a very strong setup, and it's slightly faster than Torment 16 with Hungering Arrow, because you just have these AoE explosions instead of hitting every single enemy one by one. And that also concludes the guide. I already mentioned most of the gameplay details. There's some more mechanical details of the set that I left out now for the purpose of this video. So I can recommend you, if you want to learn more, either come and ask me or check out the written guide. I have the updated GoD Demon Hunter guide from Maxwell, also linked in the description, along with the D3 planner if you want to check that out. Other than that, I think Demon Hunter is going to be amazing in Season 28, so I'm really looking forward to playing the class again. And let's see how it will go. Hope you enjoyed this video here, and see you guys next time.